You see, the people who've been on the list for years are your biggest fans, Chevy. What is up, YouTube? Welcome to Fred's Full Throttle. This week, I want to talk about some of the recent C8 Z06 news, share some insight and perspectives on a couple different stories, and hopefully address many of the questions you have about everything that's been going on. It's been a minute since I covered some Z06 news, so I won't be able to cover everything in one shot, but I did take the time to think about which stories I would cover and why. Hopefully they'll resonate for you. We've got a bunch to cover, so let's get right to it. We're going to start with a few less than ideal bits of news, and then work our way back to the fun stuff. Just like when I eat cake, I eat the middle first, and then I save the frosting for last, so I end on a high note. Up first is the news that the Corvette plant is stopping production for a week, from 8/29, which is this week, until 9/6, which is after Labor Day. The cited reason is supply chain issues, specifically that there are certain parts that have a shortage, enough so that they can't actually assemble any cars. This is likely frustrating for many, judging from what I'm seeing online, and we're just getting to Z06 production, and then the plant has to stop. This is likely to make the 2023 run of Z06s, which is already going to be kind of a short year, even shorter. This could make the 70th anniversary cars end up being fairly rare, especially in the long run. It's worth noting that this affects both the Stingray and the Z06, so the bad news is unfortunately hitting everyone. Though with the Z06 so close that a few of us lucky reservation holders could almost taste them, it feels an awfully lot like it's always just out of reach. Fingers crossed, though, that a week is enough for whichever parts are in shortage to come back in and get back online quickly. Now, speaking of Z06 production, I wanted to take a quick second to mention dealer allocations. This is old news for anyone with their finger right on the pulse of Corvette Blogger or Mid-Engine Corvette Forum, but I figured it would be helpful to give a quick overview of how dealership allocations are going to work, especially since it's not quite what everyone predicted. GM has decided that they're going to use a historic sales volume model. In this case, what that means is based on the number of 3LT 2020, 2021, 2022 C8 Stingrays sold, the more sold by a dealer, it means they get more allocations for the Z06. This is opposed to the widely speculated average days supply, or roughly how long it takes for a dealership to sell a specific car. The historic sales volume model is generally used by GM for newer models of cars, and it tends to benefit larger dealerships, and then over time, as the sales plateau, they transition to the other model. That model helps smaller dealerships who may not have a total volume of large dealers, but they are able to sell certain models quickly. Now, I wanted to bring that up in addition to the first round of allocations, which was revealed a little while ago. The first round of allocations is 315 Z06s, with 30% of those, or 85 cars, being cars with full aero. What this does is it paints a picture of how initial rollout of the cars is going to be. In short, it's going to be slow and it's going to be limited. Unfortunately, GM also has some issues in the initial numbers they released for the first allocations because they initially showed that several of the large high-volume dealerships were going to get 0 cars, including Sioka and McMulkin. I wasn't near a computer for much of this debacle, but I have to imagine that people were getting pretty upset. Fortunately, later in that same day, Chevy did update the numbers, which initially stated there would only be 196 cars in the first wave. This has surely been a bit of a roller coaster of emotion for many of you, and especially anyone who's either near the front of the line or way back in line, who may be projecting trends to estimate when they might get the car. One thing I've found helpful for myself is to not follow Z06 news too frequently. I know, it sounds a little counterintuitive. Not refreshing web pages every few hours, not checking every day what's new. It can be hard, especially when we're all so excited, but there is an upside. As things play out, as a little time passes, the facts tend to reveal themselves, and some of that initial hysteria or stress can be avoided. In a few conversations I've had recently, people have been surprised that given my channel, that I'm not clamoring for all the latest news as soon as it breaks so I can cover it. Hopefully, those that have been watching me for a little while realize that I'm not one of the YouTubers who sensationalizes every story, uses clickbaity thumbnails, or capitalizes on every little bit of drama. I try to take a more measured approach than some of my other YouTube contemporaries, and while it may not earn me as many clicks, I think it does result in better content, which is why I'm not going to cave in and move over to that model. Trust me, I'm very excited for the car. I look at all the saved pictures on my phone at least once per day. I respond to comments and emails about the car all day long. I play with the configurator. I get it. But I also think it's healthy to pace yourself a bit and hope that my approach may rub off on others. I don't like seeing everybody so stressed, everybody so upset, and I'm hoping that if I keep calm, maybe a few others will as well. But trust me, I'll be doing cartwheels the day that McMulkin calls me up. Hear that, Tommy? The next piece of news, which I promise is part of a larger analysis, is that there is a compounding constraint situation currently. You're going to hear that word a lot in this and coming videos, as well as probably on other channels, constraint. For those that aren't familiar, as I wasn't until I bought my first Corvette, a constraint is pretty much what it sounds like, a limitation on the ability to do something. There are two main categories I'm going to talk about: production constraints and options constraints. Production constraints are when GM imposes a limit on something. In this case, GM has said that the 2023 model year, the Z06 is constrained to being only 10% of all C8 Corvettes made. They call this a plant restriction, but really it's just a constraint, albeit a voluntary one, rather than imposed by limited parts or supply chain issues. Then there is an additional production constraint, where GM has decided that only 30% of Z06s will have full aero. This effectively means that only 3% of all C8s made for 2023 will be a Z06 with the full aero package. I'll talk more about this in a minute. The other type of constraint I mentioned are options constraints. These can take a few different forms. First, they can be imposed by the market or supply conditions. The worst case example of this is actually what's happening with the BGA plan to close the plant down for a week because of the lack of parts. Since these parts must be critical to the cars, they cause the entire plant to shut down and no cars can be made. The next type of these is if GM doesn't have many or any of a non-essential part. I'll use the carbon fiber wheels from Carbon Revolution as an example. A constraint on them might be that you could order the car, get the Z07 package, but not order these wheels. Unfortunately, right now, some of the parts required for the Z07 package are constrained, meaning that if your number is called, if you are able to order the car, and if you want the Z07 package, you're not actually going to be able to get it. Those buyers and reservation holders are now unfortunately finding themselves wrestling with the idea of passing on this round of allocations and then work with their dealer on how they'll handle getting a shot at the next round of allocations, or getting a car that doesn't have the options that they may have really wanted. This is really unfortunate for a number of reasons. The biggest is that it puts a bunch of people in the pretty unenviable spot of having to choose between two non-ideal options, especially when in most cases right now, the people getting those calls to place an order have been waiting years to get their car. The other big bummer here is that this further mars an already bumpy start to the Z06 rollout. Mistakes are bound to happen, such as the incorrect allocation numbers, but not having enough of a key component in what is surely one of the hottest configurations of the car is much more unfortunate. You see, the people who've been on the list for years are your biggest fans, Chevy. These are the people who like the cars you make so much that they've said, I don't know what you're going to be making, but I want in on it. These are the men and women who wear logoed apparel, who join car clubs, who are essentially the public face of the brand once they get their cars. Most people's interactions with the car outside of ownership is usually through one of these people. I'm hopeful that this is a temporary and short-lived restriction, but it's unfortunate that the car's triumphant release is getting marred by details like this. Okay, before I get to the fun news, and I promise it's coming, I wanted to share an important perspective on one of the pieces I mentioned above, and that's the relatively limited scope of the Z06s in the first wave of allocations. There have been a lot of people extrapolating the numbers and getting alarmed at what a relatively small amount of cars they say may be built over time. I'm sure you've seen this trend in general with pretty much all of the negative or less than ideal news on the Z06, and all it does is it gets everyone stressed out, upset, and frustrated. Well, I'm here to try, and I say try, to help appeal to reason. Whenever I'm feeling down about whatever the latest outrage or bad news is, I try to frame it a little bit like this. GM likes making money. GM spent a ton of money designing this car. The car is literally just beginning to launch. The embargoes on the reviews and impressions haven't even lifted yet. And side note, this isn't nefarious or hiding anything. That is normal for cars like this. Many reviewers from the first wave haven't even gotten their hands on the car yet. Chevy has every reason to make as many of these cars as they can, and they're on record, which is quoted in one of my earlier videos, saying that they will make as many of these cars as there is demand for, and that it is not a limited car. And by that they mean it is not a pre-decided maximum number of cars for total model production, unlike a car like the GT3, for example. Also, there are going to be several more variants of the C8. Chevy's words, not mine. Supply chain, chip shortages, and production problems, while not fun, are part of the norm these days. Yes, the lists are long, and many of us have been waiting quite a while. Yes, it's hard hearing so much about the car, but feeling like it's always a long way away for each of us individually. But I have yet to see any real cause for alarm. Constraints on parts will eventually lift. Plant restrictions can and likely will change. Why have a restriction set higher when they're constrained by parts shortages currently? Also, why have that restriction higher when they're still working just to establish a pace, get some real familiarity with building the car, and then build more over time? So far, only 2023 production has been spoken about by GM, and lest we forget, 2024 isn't that far away. Given historical numbers, and no reason to assume less or the worst, I don't see any reason to worry that they won't build enough of these cars. In short, try not to stress too much about this stuff. For any of you who have been part of a product launch or releasing an immensely complicated project for your work, this is generally part of the process. I don't work in the car industry, but I have been part, and in several cases, in charge of planning, designing, building, and releasing very large projects in my field with thousands of moving parts, interaction and upstream and downstream dependencies, and rarely does everything go completely smoothly. Sometimes it goes smoothly, and your customers are not very aware of all those challenges you face behind the scenes. And sometimes it doesn't. Given that most of us haven't even seen a production Z06 yet, and that there's little more than a few handfuls of those CTF cars out and about, I think it's awfully premature to write off everything that comes next, to say that no one will ever get a car, which is a real favorite of internet trolls, or that production will end before high-numbered reservation holders get their cars. The Z06 is coming, whether you stress over it or not, so you might as well take a step back, stop hitting refresh on your browser so much, and let it all just happen. You'll be happier and maybe even enjoy the rest of that path on your way to getting the car. But enough from me, a 30-something car enthusiast in New Hampshire. Let's get on to the fun stuff. First up, per John at Mid-Engine Corvette Forum. Hi, John. And first reported by our man Keith over at Corvette Blogger. Hi Keith. Comes great news about the Z06 from Corvettes at Carlisle. Corvette Chief Engineer Taj announced that the Z06 with the Z07 package has a top speed of... Next, and just a quick point, is to double check your reservation numbers. After my slot hasn't moved since January, a subscriber named Terry reached out to me and mentioned that he'd moved a handful of spots down. So I checked, and sure enough, I moved 6 slots. I'll take it. I'm in the 1150s now. It's not a lot, but at least it's something, and it gave me a little boost throughout my day. Shout out to Terry, whose name you see on the sign here. I've been enjoying our email exchanges, and I appreciate your patience in me at sometimes being slow to respond. Have a great day, man. Lastly, I wanted to end with what I consider to be the best news of the video, and that's that some of the press cars have been floating around for the last 2 weeks or so. Amelia Hartford and Speed Phenom have both shared videos in the new Z06. Rather than recap, I'll link to all 3 of those videos below, but I wanted to share several observations I had from watching these. First, GM needs to get some better audio gear with the recordings they've made, because the unstaged, real-world sound of the car is much closer to the videos that Amelia and Austin have posted than anything that GM has released. The snarls, the crackling, and the growling of the cars is infectious, and it gives the car tremendous presence. Having only heard the car for a short time in person earlier this year, I can confirm that the sound is much better than what you get from any of their videos, and it's going to snap necks and turn heads anywhere it goes. Next, the acceleration and the urgency with which the car accelerates looks fantastic. Again, we have a number of people with concerns that the car isn't pulling as hard as they hoped. Spare me the drama. None of these videos are out there trying to set records or squeeze 10/10ths out of the car. I realize that everyone is hyper-analyzing video because people don't have a lot to go on right now, but jeepers, give GM a little benefit of the doubt. Every Corvette that's come out for the last couple of generations, there's been a whole group of people who whine and complain before the car launches, or before they see one, or sit in one, or drive one, or own one. And you know what happens? The car ends up being fantastic in spite of all that. Next, the drama and immediacy of the car seems appropriately frenetic and powerful. Particularly in Austin's footage on the track, the car seems to be begging for them to push the car harder and brake later. I've been mulling for a while if I would be okay giving up the manual transmission in my C7 for the DCT and the Z. Yep, consider me good with it now. Lastly, we're all going to have to retrain our brains to not short shift the car. In all the videos, it's apparent that most of the shifts are happening at what would be the red line in a normal C8 or a C7 such as mine, and that most drivers probably aren't used to the car yet. This is going to be a fun habit to break ourselves of, though we should also be cautious when we step back in normal cars so we don't blow seals and gaskets redlining everywhere we go. That's all for this week, as I'm sure this is probably becoming a pretty long video, but I appreciate you sticking with me to the end. So thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, Fred out!